Today we talk about a somewhat particular topic, a topic that mixes ships. You see it from the background behind me. But also politics, society, technological evolution is a bit of everything. We find it in an episode that dates back over a century ago, an episode that is essentially never talked about in Europe. I've never understood the reason. After all, I believe that certain topics should be addressed primarily to understand the evolution of human society. Apparently, in Italian history books, there is no room to delve into events that happened in South America in 1910. Today's story is set in Brazil. You imagine Brazil as soccer, carnival, samba, colors, scents. Okay, that's the folklore. I'm not arguing about that, but Brazil is also much more. Brazil is first and foremost the largest territorial state in South America, as well as an economic power even today. And it was also at the end of the 19th century, in fact, an expanding power, a power such as to trigger an arms race that did not lead to a war with neighboring states as much as the prerequisites were there, but led to a small social revolution, to what was called the Whip Revolt, to what was called in Portuguese the Chibata Revolt. And today we can translate it into the Whip Revolt of 1910, it was said. But to understand exactly why in 1910 the so-called Whip Revolt happens, well, we have to, as is our custom, go a little further back in time. A few decades earlier, at the end of the 19th century, the states of South America are in strong expansion. There is also the episode of the Saltpeter War, but that's not the topic we will discuss today. There are mainly territorial disputes between the various independent states of South America, primarily between Chile and Argentina, disputes that concern Patagonia. I don't need to explain what it is. I imagine you already know. Well, those disputes lead to an arms race that begins in 1887 when Chile decides to modernize its fleet. Because in anticipation of a possible clash against Argentina, it is realized that the fight will not only be on land, but also at sea. The arms race becomes something never seen before, at least in the southern hemisphere. In a few years, from 1887 to 1901, so essentially in 14 years, Argentina and Chile modernize their fleets, buy and spend a lot of money to purchase weapons and ships, increasingly modern ships. But something happens that completely disrupts the picture. And that something is not just Brazil's entry into the disputes, which wants to establish itself as a superpower in South America, also to protect its own trade, for the rubber trade and the coffee trade to the old continent. And not only something happens in 1906, but it does not happen in South America. It happens in Europe. In 1906, England presents the His Majesty's ship Dreadnought, the world's first all-big gun battleship. A groundbreaking vessel transforms all. From that moment, all other ships in service in various navies around the world suddenly become obsolete, practically useless. And from that moment, a new arms race begins everywhere in the world. One of these, we have already talked about in other videos, will lead to the First World War. It will be one of the contributing causes of the First World War. The arms race between the British Royal Navy and the OXE fleets of Kaiser Wilhelm in South America. Brazil decides to move first. And what does it do? Orders from British shipyards 3 new battleships on the Dreadnought model. It's the Minas Gerais class, named after the federal state of the mines, the area of Belo Horizonte. For those who know Brazil, the Minas Gerais class commands attention. Like at that moment, the most powerful and modern class of ships ever made. The fact that a state like Brazil, which is not a European power, can have such ships, well, it causes imbalances. And it makes Argentina and Chile decide to go down the same path. The Chileans always order from the British shipyards another class of quartz, even more powerful, the Almirante La Torre class. Only one will be delivered, and moreover, after the Great War. The Argentinians even indicate an international competition for the supply of new dreadnoughts. The United States, England, France, Italy participate. In the end, the order is awarded to the United States for the Riva de Villa class. But we remain on the Brazilian dreadnoughts. Only 2 are delivered, the lead ship, the Minas Gerais, and the Sao Paulo. The 3rd will not be delivered. Brazil will give up the order. Because in the meantime, diplomatic situations will have reduced territorial disputes to minor issues, and because a major economic crisis will hit South America in 1913. For this reason, the 3rd ship will be resold to Turkey and then forcibly acquired by the builder Great Britain. This, too, a contributing cause of the Great War, because it will push the Ottoman Empire into the arms of the Central Empires. But let's stay, as mentioned, on the Minas Gerais. They are powerful, new, modern ships, and above all, they are built in England. England, which in 1910 and in previous years is a great democracy. It is a country that has also been a promoter of significant openings in terms of rights, basic rights, the fundamental rights of the person. The new Brazilian crews to train in the use of those ships never seen before are sent right to England during the construction of the dreadnoughts to start getting used to the use of those new ships. There's one thing to say. At the time, that is at the beginning of the 20th century, the Brazilian Navy relied on a large, low force of mulattoes, or descendants of African slaves. Recruitment was based on the poorest parts of Brazilian society, and it gave the opportunity, or at least the illusion, to these lower classes to be able to find a livelihood, and perhaps also a small social redemption by wearing the Navy's uniform. But it wasn't like that if we have to quote the words of Baron de Rio Branco for the recruitment of Brazilian Marines and sailors. We have brought on board our ships the scum of our urban centers, the most useless underclass, without any kind of preparation, former slaves and children of slaves. These are the crews of our ships. The consideration by the large landowners of most politicians, and obviously the entirely white officer class of the troops on board the ships, is very low. Even in that period, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Brazilian Navy resorted to the whip, to corporal punishment. It's something that horrifies in Europe. Europe has abolished slavery for a long time now. Even the United States, after the Civil War, abolished slavery. Although racial segregation will continue to exist in the South for another century, in Brazil, slaves were freed through the so-called Golden Law, but a few decades after that law. They are still considered second-class or even third-class citizens. When these men are sent to England, well, they breathe a completely different air, an air of freedom, a truly, truly free air, an air of progress, especially social. In the evening, when they go out on franchise, they are well received in the pubs. No one insults them. No one looks at them sideways for the color of their skin. No one thinks of whipping them. Those sailors, when they return home on the new ships, are no longer the submissive slaves they once were. They are changed citizens and would like to change the customs of the Brazilian Navy and conversely of the entire Brazilian state. Does it seem like a little? Does it seem like too much? Well, for those men, it was neither too little nor too much. It was just right. But let's get to 1910. For some time now, from a position of weakness, the sailors of color on the ships had been thinking of asking for improvements to their lives, to propose demands to change the treatment on board, and not only reserved for them, but what really changes the pivotal moment is something that happens on the morning of November 22, 1910. The revolt breaks out on board the flagship of the fleet, La Minas Gerais. Faced with the proposal to punish the lower force with whips once again, the sailors can't take it anymore. On board, the revolt is total. The sailors take control of the ship by force, kill the commander and several officers, even some sailors who remained loyal. You can really hear the sound of gunfire on board the Minas Gerais, which is anchored in front of the port of Rio de Janeiro. But it's not an isolated revolt confined to one ship. No, even on the other ships, they start shooting, they start revolting. After the Minas Gerais, its twin the Sao Paulo, also revolts. Then the scout ship Bahia, then an old coastal battleship, the Deodoro. All the ships imprison the officers or kill them or throw them overboard. They elect a sailor, João Candido Felisberto, as their representative. It is he who, aboard the Sao Paulo, incites all the others to revolt. From that moment on, a real crisis for the Brazilian state begins. How to behave towards those who were defined as rays, the scum of society who had dared to rebel against the white officers and ask for better treatment. How to behave in front of those mutineers who had asked for humane treatment and threatened in return in case their demands were not met. In case the state had reacted with the force of using the battleship's cannons to bombard Rio de Janeiro, which at the time was the federal capital of Brazil, what to do? For some time, the Brazilian state remained suspended. President Hermes da Fonseca, nephew of the first president of Brazil after the end of the imperial period, is conflicted. A telegram has been sent to him by the insurgents. The telegram is clear. We do not want the return of the whip. We demand an immediate response, and if we do not receive it, we will destroy the city and also the other ships that have not joined the revolt. But it must be said that Felisberto and the others do not limit themselves to communicating with the Brazilian layer, asking for the end of slavery on board. They also send messages addressed to other South American nations, but also to European countries and the United States. These messages sent from Sao Paulo, selected today, make it clear what the climate was like on board. What were they saying? We, as sailors and as Brazilian citizens and supporters of the Brazilian Republic, can no longer accept the slavery practiced within the Brazilian Navy. We do not receive and have never received the protection guaranteed to us by this nation. This is what the sailors say. They want justice, they want fair treatment, but President Fonseca doesn't know what to do. Even the admirals don't know, who are torn between two possibilities. The first is to negotiate, but Parliament stands in the way. The second is to try to attack the rebel ships with what remains of the fleet and with the artillery of the bay. Those in the forts that have already targeted the ships and could fire at any moment. However, no one likes this second option. Those ships, the Minas Gerais and its twin, cost a heap of money. Sinking them, if it's even possible, would mean wasting a lot of money and, among other things, exposing oneself to international embarrassment and at risk of attack from, for example, Argentina, which is in the process of modernizing its fleet and may well be willing to attack a state in difficulty. So what to do? A deputy is appointed, José Carlos de Carvalho. Carvalho is a former Navy captain. He knows the situation on board. He goes to Parliament. He embarks on a launch. He boards one of the battleships and talks to the rebels. Upon his return to Parliament, he drafts a precise report. The rebels are determined. They are organized. The ship's armament is in perfect condition, so the risk of a civil war starting from the sea are real. Even though the president continues to consider the military option, he does not want to give in. Giving in would mean rediscussing the entire social structure of Brazil. However, one cannot even think of intervening outright. Meanwhile, the rebels decide to move away from the Bay of Rio de Janeiro, to take cover from the possible fire of the coastal fort cannons. In Congress, there is a senator, the former presidential candidate Rui Barbosa, who takes the side of the rebels. Rui Barbosa. De Oliveira is a jurist, a famous politician. He was also a writer himself, who had been defeated by Fonseca in the last presidential race. He uses the rhetoric of the rebels to point out how the Brazilian state has become a monster that devours its own children. Those ships, says Rui Barbosa, were built and paid for also thanks to the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of slaves who died in the plantations, to allow the large landowners to become rich and pay taxes. With those taxes, Brazil became a wealthy nation and a militarily powerful nation. Something must be given back. One way or another, it must be acknowledged that those sailors are Brazilian citizens, just like everyone else. An amnesty law is proposed, but Fonseca opposes it. He would like to launch an attack on the ships to show that the Brazilian state is not joking, but there is no time. And above all, the ships have already gone out to sea, too far for a full-scale attack. Amnesty becomes the only viable path. The vote is 125 in favor, 23 against. Fonseca could use his veto power, but he realizes he has almost the entire parliament against him, so he ratifies the amnesty. The ships can return. The mutineers will not be punished. On November 26, 4 days later, after the explosion of the revolt, the ships return. They accept. At 7 p.m. on November 26, all the mutineers have returned home. It ends here. It's all over. Everything is okay. No, because that revolt leaves very heavy marks within the Brazilian Navy and the Brazilian state. Among the conditions of the amnesty, the landing of the cannon shutters is set. The ships are disarmed. For a long time, they will be kept in reserve precisely to avert the risk of new mutinies. And what about the mutineers? Of course, the amnesty was supposed to cover them. It was supposed to give them the chance to start over. The only real consequence of the Whip Rebellion is precisely the elimination of all corporal punishment. The whip, the scourge, the deprivation of food. All these measures are scrapped and then deleted from the Brazilian Naval Discipline Code. However, the mutineers' Navy careers are over. They will all be dishonorably discharged, but just a few weeks later, the Brazilian state will demand revenge against them. Many of these will find themselves arrested when the state declares a state of siege after further riots that will break out in the country. Several of these imprisoned mutineers will be sent to the Amazon to die among snakes, poisonous insects, tropical diseases in the most unhealthy plantations in the world. Those who remain in prisons are locked up among rats to die of starvation. Felisberto manages to survive the harsh conditions of imprisonment. Many of his companions, exposed to toxic fumes inside the prison, die. They die in isolation cells, in their sleep, or trying in every way to beat on the iron doors to get them open to survive. Felisberto spends 18 months moving from one prison to another until he ends up in psychiatric hospitals. He and 9 other sailors have to wait a year and a half before they end up in front of a military court, which judges them for their mutiny. Worse still, it judges them responsible for having instigated, with their example, that of November 22, 1910, the subsequent revolts, but the court recognizes that Felisberto and the others had no responsibility in the subsequent revolts. Over time, with the passage of so much time, Brazil will finally admit its own mistake of enslaving entire populations and generations, first in the plantations and then in its own armed forces. It will take a lot more time for the people of color, the mulattoes, the descendants of slaves within Brazilian society, to obtain full rights and full recognition of their Brazilian citizenship. If all this happens, it is also thanks to Felisberto and his companions, who decided to implement the liberal philosophy they had learned in England that day in November. Where had they understood that another world was possible, that there was not exclusively a world made of slavery, deprivation, and whips? It was a different world, a new world. The world of the 20th century. It can be said that Felisberto and his companions, with strength, but also the strength of reason, dragged Brazil into the 20th century, not only at a technological and military level, but rather at a social level. Today at the Ilha das Cobras, former arsenal of the Brazilian Navy, there is a monument depicting Felisberto. It's a monument of a man looking up and reaching out to the sky. How to invoke a long-denied and finally won freedom. It's no small feat. The gesture of Felisberto and others teaches us that those fundamental rights that we sometimes take for granted, well, there are those who have to earn them or even have to obtain them by force. Because unfortunately, for a very long time, the human being has chained his brother. Just because he was born in another land, because he spoke another language, because he prayed to another god, or because he had physical traits, starting with the skin, different from his own. Here we are, just a few days away from Christmas Day, and it's clear we are all busy looking for gifts. Gifts that are often of a technological nature. These are gifts that can be purchased in consumer electronics stores in large chains, and they can be smartphones, tablets, PCs. In short, items for browsing or even items for playing, like the big video gaming platforms. All tools that browse online and require security. We at Inside the Story. Thank you all